We're going to take a look at how authors use transitions in a biography piece of writing. The piece of writing that we're going to read is called Bessie Coleman. Let's just review some of the transitional words that we could choose from or that we might see as we are reading. To show order, some examples would be after, before, during, second, since, then. A lot of biographies are written in order, and these are words that you will most likely see and use from when you're talking about events that happen in an order. To add any information, some words like additionally, along with, another, as well as, for example, for instance, these are words that can be used either when you're going from one piece of idea to another, or even within the same idea and you're trying to explain something else within that piece of information. To indicate a purpose or a reason, some words would be in hope that, in order to, because, and then to conclude. All in all, as a result, in conclusion, in summary, therefore, lastly, overall, this leaves the reader with something to think about as you're reading. Let's go back to the book, Bessie Coleman. As I read, I'm going to begin highlighting some important things that we see as we are working on transitional words. To give some background information about Bessie Coleman, she was an aviator or an airplane pilot, and she was the first African American woman to become a pilot in the United States. She had the determination to become a pilot, and so you'll learn a little bit about that as we go through this text. I will not read everything to you, but we will look at some important points to be able to see what she did and then how this author used transition words to help us understand what we're reading. Let's start with the introduction. The introduction is going to be the hook. You have already worked on your hook or your lead, but if after reading this introduction you think, wow, there's something I should be adding to my introduction, go ahead and add that in. That's what good authors do. When they're reading something, they use and borrow ideas from other authors to help them with their own writing. So let's read about Bessie Coleman. In the United States in the 1920s, few women flew planes, and it was unthinkable that an African American woman could fly. Yet Bessie Coleman did just that. Bessie was a brave African American woman who fought discrimination to follow her dream of becoming a pilot. Her determination opened doors for other African Americans and women who came after her. On this page, you are going to see Growing Up in Texas. Here is a good heading to help us understand what we're going to be reading about with Bessie Coleman. There is also a map here to help us see the location. This is a great text feature that helps us visualize what we're reading. Bessie Coleman was born in Atlanta, Texas in 1892. Her mother was African American and her father was of African American and Choctaw Native American descent. Her parents were sharecroppers. Bessie was one of 13 children. 2 years after Bessie's birth, the family moved to Waxahachie, Texas, where Bessie's father hoped that a busy town would offer good jobs. I'm going to pause right there. Here is a time frame that helps me to understand what happened and when it happened. This transitional phrase, 2 years after Bessie's birth, tells me she was 2 years old when they moved from one location to another. She had to walk miles each day to an all-black school. She loved reading and books, and she was a whiz at math. On this next page, it tells us a little bit about how Bessie's father was really upset about the discrimination towards people who were African American. So he wanted them to move, and his wife wouldn't do that. So he had left the family when Bessie was 9 years old. Here is a transitional phrase, around that time. So it's happening in conjunction with her being 9 years old. Bessie's older brothers grew up and also moved away. Bessie's mother worked as a maid while Bessie helped take care of her younger sisters. On this page, it talks about her when she's living in Texas and growing up on a cotton farm. In Texas, cotton growing was big business. During the cotton harvest, everyone in the family worked in the fields for extra money. Here is a really good transitional phrase. During the cotton harvest. And it gives a reason why she did not like picking cotton. It says, even though she worked in the fields, Bessie managed to finish all 8 grades in the local school. So she must have been a really hard worker and determined to finish her schooling if she was working on the cotton fields and going to school. She really wanted to go to college, so she wanted to save money by washing people's clothes. Here's a transitional phrase. In about 4 years, she had enough to begin school. She enrolled in a college for African Americans, but after 1 year, she ran out of money and had to return home. So here it is in about 4 years. That gives me a good time frame for Bessie Coleman and what she was able to save in that time. So some of her brothers had traveled to Chicago, and it says one day. Here's a good transitional phrase, one day. And then they contacted Bessie. She was going to get a job in the big city. Here is a time frame with a transitional phrase, at the age of 23. So she had to go to a train and it was very uncomfortable. This paragraph starts with a transitional phrase right here. When Bessie arrived in Chicago, she moved in with her brothers, Walter and John, and their wives, making 5 people in one small apartment. So this is talking about what it was like when she moved into this big city, but a very small apartment. She became a manicurist, so she worked on nails, and she actually found a job at the White Sox barber shop in Chicago's South Side. The top of this page also gives a time frame. When America entered World War I, both of her brothers entered or enlisted in the army. So they went over to France to fight in the war. Down here, it talks about when her brothers returned. So after the war was over, they told Bessie stories about the war. John teased her, saying that French women were braver than American women and that they could fly airplanes. Hearing stories about the brave pilots made Bessie realize what she wanted to do. She wanted to become a pilot, but who would teach her? No one, she asked, would teach a black woman to fly. So hearing that no one would teach her didn't stop Bessie. She decided not to give up. One of her friends told her that somebody over in France would teach her to fly. So she had to actually save up a lot of money, which she got from working in a restaurant. And then she was able to take and go over to France to take flying lessons. In 1920, there's a year as a transitional phrase, Bessie traveled on a ship to France. She was pleased to find that there was no discrimination against African Americans in France. She could eat in any restaurant and ride wherever she wished on the trains. So unlike here in the United States, where people who are African American had to sit in certain places on the buses or sit in certain places at a restaurant and go to different schools, it wasn't like that in France. So she learned to fly what was called a biplane, and this has 2 pairs of wings and 2 open cockpits. Okay, so she was a good student and she was ready to fly solo or by herself in a few months. In 1921, there's another transitional phrase with a year, at the age of 29. That gives me a good idea of the time that has passed. Bessie became the first African American pilot. She also became the first African American to earn an international pilot's license. Down here, it shows you the diagram and labels of where those pieces are in the biplane, stick, and a rudder bar. Do you know, early planes had extremely simple controls. A stick like a joystick controlled the plane's up and down movement. A rudder bar on the floor controlled the side-to-side movement. Pilots pushed the rudder bar back and forth with their feet. Here I see a new heading called Triumphant Return. Triumphant means like victorious or like a win. And I wonder if she's returning back to the United States. In the fall of 1921, so it gives me a really good idea of a time frame with that transitional phrase, Bessie returned to America. Both Black and white Americans learned of Bessie's accomplishment. She was interviewed by reporters and invited to special events. She was greeted with applause and respect. So here she wants to start a flying school, especially for people who are African American. She was going to make money by performing at air shows, and if you look at the top, there's a photograph of what it looks like of a biplane performing a stunt at an air show. Now this is present day, but it kind of gives you an idea. She has to perform tricks on a plane. So this paragraph starts with a transitional phrase and the transition word before. Before Bessie could be part of an air show, she had to return to France to learn more about flying, including stunts and tricks. When Bessie came back to the United States, here's when, and after every transition word or phrase, you see the comma. Robert Abbott helped her organize an air show near New York City on September 3rd, 1922. It was the first time a Black woman had ever given an air show. So this heading is titled Barnstormer. It's stating that Bessie's reputation as a pilot, it spread fast across the country. She became a barnstormer, and that's in bold, a pilot who traveled around the country using farmers' fields for air shows. So she was really well known, and she would do lots of stunts within the air that would make it really fun for people to watch her. This page is basically saying that parachuting from the plane was another one of her stunts. And she also took people, even people who are Black, up in her aircraft to fly with her. She wanted to make sure that no one was discriminated against and that everyone, including people who are African American, could watch this air show. Some transitions on this page include at first. At first, Bessie had to borrow a plane for her shows. In time, so this is sequential order, first she was borrowing, and now Bessie had enough money to buy her own plane, a Curtiss Jenny. So that's the type of plane that it was. Shortly after she bought the plane, its engine jammed and she crashed. Bessie had a broken leg, broken ribs, and numerous cuts. She was in the hospital for 3 months. As soon as she was released, here's the transitional phrase, as soon as she was released, Bessie went right back to flying with determination she has. Here is a time frame. In April of 1926, Bessie agreed to do a show in Jacksonville, Florida that included a parachute jump. So her and her mechanic took the parachute and the plane up. She wasn't wearing her seatbelt, but as soon as she was about ready to jump out and looking for a good place, the plane suddenly went into a spin. Bessie fell out of the plane and was killed. And both her and the mechanic, William Wills, was killed as well. And then this says the country had lost a true aviation pioneer and one of its favorite pilots. This last page says, after her death, so here is a transitional phrase, the U.S. Post Office issued a stamp in her honor and a Chicago street was named after her. May 2nd has been declared Bessie Coleman Day in Chicago. Here's another transitional phrase. 3 years after Bessie's death, one of her most important dreams was fulfilled. The Bessie Coleman Aero Club was opened in Chicago. It was the first flight school for African Americans. So even though she didn't get to personally see that dream come true of having a school open to help African Americans learn how to fly, that actually did happen. So now that you have a good look at some of the transitional words and phrases within a biography, go back and try some of your own using the sheet to help you.